The number one reason why practices fail at RTM isn't because patients don't like it. It's not because insurance doesn't pay for it. It's not because the technology doesn't work. It's because the staff refuses to use it or adopt it, right, or accept it. I've talked to practice owners, they've said things like, we signed up for RTM, but the therapist won't offer it to patients. They say they're too busy. They say it's just one more thing. And the program died before it even got started. I've heard that dozens and dozens of times over the past couple of years. And I almost had the same problem in my own practice, right? This literally happened to me right from the beginning. And so let me tell you, what happened and how we turned staff resistance into staff buy-in. My name's Dr. Andrew Gorecki. I'm a physical therapist, private practice owner, and I also own MovementRX, which is the best remote therapeutic monitoring company in my opinion. And this is the most important video you're going to watch about implementing RTM. I can guarantee you that. So let me just start by acknowledging something that's super important. Your staff's resistance is legitimate, right? They're not being difficult. They're not being lazy. They have real concerns, right? And here's what they're thinking when you announce a new program. They're thinking, this is more work for me, right? They're already seeing 8 to 10 patients a day. They're already doing, loads of documentation. And they're already dealing with prior auths and insurance, phone calls and hassles, right? And now here you are adding something else, right? Of course they're going to resist. Totally normal. Another thing I think that they're thinking that I've heard is, this is going to take time I don't have, right? They assume RTM means learning new software, time, creating different, different home programs, more of their time, making monitoring calls, not going to do it, takes way too much time, and then more documentation, right? They're already maxed out. So where is this time supposed to come from? They're also thinking that this is just about the money, right? It's not about patient care. They became therapists to help people, not generate revenue, right? So they perceive RTM as a cash grab, and they're going to resist it just on that principle. They're also thinking, I don't understand it, so I don't trust it, right? RTM's new, the billing codes are unfamiliar, they don't know, how it works, right? And people resist what they don't understand. That's totally normal, natural human behavior, right? They're also thinking, well, what if I do it, and what if I get it wrong and get in trouble, right? They're worried about billing incorrectly, or they're worried about getting audited. They're worried about, doing something that might violate, compliance rules. What if I'm blamed if something goes wrong? These are all legitimate concerns as well, right? I think you would agree with that. And if you don't address them head on, right, your RTM program is going to fail before it even starts. And so let me show you how we addressed each one of these thoughts that people told us they're having. And really they're pushback to us implementing this successfully right off the bat. So when I first learned about RTM, I was excited. I saw the dollar signs. I saw a solution to a financial problem, but I also saw the outcomes. I believe that engagement's important, but I made the classic mistake. I announced it to my staff, like, hey, everybody, we're going to implement this new program, and it's called Remote Therapeutic Monitoring, and it's going to add to about $30,000 a month, and we're going to be able to pay everybody more, and I'm super excited about it, and we're going to fight that declining reimbursement, and here's how it works. I led with the financial aspect of this, and I could literally see it on their faces, right? Great. Another thing, to make the owner rich while we do more work, right? It literally was a disaster from the beginning. And so I stopped, I regrouped, I listened to them, and I tried again, right? And so here's what I did differently, kind of that second go around. First, I led with, what's in this for the patient, right? Not the revenue from the clinic, but what's in this for the patient? So I called the staff meeting and I said, you know what? I want to talk about a problem that we all see every single day, right? Patients are not doing their home exercises. And how do I know that? Well, I have studies to show that 70% don't do their home exercises. We spend all this time creating programs, we're teaching them what to do, and then they just don't do them. Does everybody agree with that? And I think everybody in the room is like, yeah, I've had that experience a lot. And we know that the compliance is about 30%. And so that's not great. But when patients don't do their home programs, right, what happens? Their progress is slower, they need more visits, their outcomes aren't as good, and they blame who? They're going to blame us as the providers for poor results. And, so what if we could double patient compliance with home programs? What would that mean for our outcomes? Do you think patients would do better, right? Now I had their attention, because this was about patient care, not money. And I think we have to recognize that's very important. That's why we went into this profession in the first place. All right, so then I showed them the research. So I shared our data that we had, our preliminary data, because we've had this software way before RTM was a thing. And I showed them that the patients that were being monitored and engaged, they actually had better outcomes, right? That's great, right? So it's not just about billing codes. This is actually helping the patient get better. I was able to pull a few other studies as well to show them that the more the patient engages their home program, the better they do in physical therapy, right? Then I addressed the workload concern directly. I said, you know what? You're all busy. I'm not going to ask you to add 20 hours a week of work. That's ridiculous. So here's what will actually change for you. What stays the same, right? You're going to create the home program like you always do, right? You've already been doing that. You're already teaching your patients how to do their exercises properly. You're going to keep doing that. You're going to keep, doing your documentation. There's going to be no changes, right? But what does change is you're just going to use an app instead, right? Instead of paper handouts, right? You're going to use an app, and you'll add one sentence to your documentation on the plan of care, which we're going to give you a template for. That's it. You don't have to, you don't have to make monitoring phone calls, right? That was a big, they didn't want to do that from the beginning. We hired a remote PTA to do that. You don't have to track your time. The software is going to do it naturally for you automatically. You don't have to build the codes. We're going to handle that internally as an admin task. Literally, your job as a provider stays the exact same. And that's what I would recommend you do as well. You just use a different software, and you can do that, right? This is something you're already doing, right? So I saw immediately them relax. The shoulder shrug went away, and this isn't scary, right? This isn't scary. You just had to make it less scary. Then I addressed the what do I do if, right? What do I do if I do wrong? Fear that they had, and so we're gonna train everyone properly. We're gonna go ahead and give you templates and scripts, and we're gonna do this as a team, right? So that if something goes wrong, it's not on you, it's on me as the owner, right? Taking away that responsibility that they felt, as a new program without, tons of information. I think they felt that way. So I put it on me, right? Your job is just to offer, to the appropriate patient, a home exercise program using an app, right? That's it. And so then I asked for their input, right? And I said, okay, before we implement this, I want to hear from you. I want to hear what are your concerns. I want to know, what are you worried about? What questions do you have, right? What would make, this easier for you to implement? Right? So you got to listen. You got to find out what it is, right? Some of the things that they told me, what do we tell patients who ask if it costs money? Okay. How do we know which patients are appropriate? What if the patient doesn't have a smartphone, right? These are legit questions. What if the patient can't figure out the app? Right? That was a big one. These are all totally solvable problems, by the way, but also legit questions. So what did we do? We created a patient information sheet that explains if there is any cost, which there's no co-pays, but it may go to deductible. We created a simple checklist of appropriate patients. We made a plan for patients without smartphones, right? By the way, patients can use it on their computer as well, our software. We made front desk support, tech help, right? That they know how to use the software as well. And then we made it optional at first. I said, for the first month or two, this is optional. If you want to try it with your patients, great. If you want to wait and see how it's going, that's fine too, right? So there's no pressure, there's no judgment. Let's learn this together, right? And we did have our clinical directors kind of be like the champions, so they were doing it for sure. But this removed the fear. So what happened? What do you think happened, right? Well, our clinical directors did it, but then we had 2 therapists volunteer to try it first, right? They each enrolled about 5 to 10 patients that first week. But after 2 weeks, they reported back to the team, which I thought was really important to do. They said, it's actually pretty easy. I feel like it's actually less time than me going and printing, exercises. Patients seem to like it. Took maybe 2 extra minutes per patient. The app was super intuitive, right? Hearing that positive feedback, now the other therapists wanted to try it, right? Within a month, we had everybody on board. Everybody was using it. And so within 3 months, it was just part of our normal workflow. We've culturally adapted and we've accepted it, right? But let me tell you the mistakes that I see practice owners make, right? That I guarantee you is going to give you staff resistance. I guarantee it, right? So the first mistake I see that's the most common is, announcing it as a done deal, right? We're doing RTM starting Monday and we've got this company we're working with and here's how it works, right? Why does this fail? Well, it fails because your staff feels like it's being forced on them. There was no discussion, right? They didn't have any input, and they're going to resist naturally. That's natural human behavior. A better approach is, I'm exploring RTM as a way to improve patient outcomes and practice revenue, and I really want to get your input before we make the decision. That's the better way to do it, right? Another big mistake I see practice owners making is that they're leading with the revenue, right? So they're talking about how much revenue it's going to generate. And that's important, but why it fails is because staff thinks, great, more money for the owner, more work for me, right? A better approach is, this could help patients actually do their homework better. And when that happens, they're going to get better outcomes. And yeah, we get reimbursed for that time we're already spending. That's a positive way to look at it. Another big mistake is dumping it on staff without support, right? Here's the login, figure it out, start enrolling patients. It's not going to work, right? It's not going to work because staff feels abandoned. They don't know what to do. They avoid it. And a much better approach is going to be, hey, we're going to go through this comprehensive training, right? Hopefully you have a vendor that you're working with that actually does training and they give you the training ahead of time so you can kind of take a look at it. But we're going to be available for questions. We're going to implement this together as a team, right? We're all doing this together. That's a positive way to do this. Another huge mistake I see is making it mandatory immediately, right? Everyone must enroll at least this many patients, a month. And again, why does that fail? Staff feels pressure. You've taken away their autonomy. They feel rushed. They make mistakes. They resent it. A better approach might be, hey, let's start with a pilot, volunteers first. Let's learn what works before we scale. Probably a better idea, right? And hopefully you have a vendor that helps you with this too. Another big one is not addressing the what's in it for me question, right? Staff are thinking, well, why should I care about this, right? Why does this fail? It fails because there's no benefit to them personally. They're not going to prioritize it if there's no benefit to them. A better approach might be when patients have better outcomes, your job is easier, right? You get better reviews. You feel more successful as a clinician, right? And if this improves our practice, revenue, right, specifically, then I can give you raises. I can give you bonuses. That you need to address that. Don't ignore that. That's a real thought process that providers have, staff have, right? Another big mistake is ignoring their concerns completely. Like, staff's, I'm worried about compliance. Owner says, what? Don't worry about it. Just do it, right? This is gonna fail because you're leaving unaddressed concerns. They become resistance. A much better approach is agree with them. It is a legitimate concern, right? Let me show you exactly how we're going to ensure compliance. Here's our documentation process. Here's what happened when our vendor got audited and what they help us with and to protect us as we go, if we ever have to go through an audit. Another big mistake is, no follow-up or support, right? You do the initial training, then disappear, right? Or especially if you're doing it by yourself, you really need to have the company that you're working with who has the software help you with training. It's going to fail though because staff hit obstacles. They don't know how to solve them. A much better approach is, we're going to have a weekly check-in for the first month. What's working, what's not, how can I help, right? That's a much better mindset as the owner or the manager to have. Let me share a real quote, right? So one of my staff members, after we've been using RTM for about 6 months, her name is Sarah. She said, with 12 years of experience, I was super skeptical at first. I thought it was going to be a hassle, but honestly, it's made my job so much easier. My patients are actually doing their exercises and I can see their engagement. And, the data's there, right? So it's making a big difference. And actually, I just got a review on Google from one of the patients the other day. So how cool is that, right? She also said she knows what patients need encouragement to do more, which ones need, just a high five because they're doing awesome. And, when patients get better faster, that's great, right? That's a reward for me as a provider. One of our PTAs, Mike, he talked about the app is way better than printing out exercise sheets. You can even take custom videos on the spot with your patient with our software, and he loves that part of it. It takes less time. Patients can watch the videos at home, and he doesn't have to re-demonstrate things as much because they can simply watch the video again, right? And he said, he should have been using this for years, and he was super pumped that we had implemented it. So far, positive feedback from our staff. We even had some feedback from our front desk. Jessica said, I was worried patients would complain about the cost or the technology issues, but we've honestly had very few problems, right? Most patients think it's cool and that we're using technology, and the few tech issues we have had, I just help them during check-in, and it's not a big deal, right? So gotta love that, right? Even the front desk is getting involved with this process. One of our PTs, David, he's our clinical director. He talked about, he thought this was going to be a nightmare to manage, right? But the remote providers, they handle all the monitoring for us. They handle all the phone calls for us. The software tracks everything that happens automatically, and the therapists literally just have to make the home program. They barely even notice a difference in their workflow. And so the only thing that they notice is that patients are more compliant, they're more engaged, and they show up more for their appointments. That's a huge win. And then finally, our PT, Amanda, she said, you know what? My favorite part is getting messages from the remote providers about patient concerns, right? Like a patient will mention, something like during a monitoring call, maybe like having pain with an exercise, or they're confused about, maybe something that the PT said. And then that gets relayed back, right, as a heads up for the next visit. And that actually improves the PT in the office, that improves her communications, because she can go, hey, I heard you're having a hard time with this home program. This one exercise, let's modify that, right? Let's modify that together. So, the common themes, it's easier than expected. It's, patients like it. It improves outcomes. It doesn't add a significant workload to the provider that's in the clinic. It actually makes their job easier in a lot of ways. Not one person said, I wish we had never done this, right? So if you're implementing RTM, here's your staff buy-in checklist, right? You got to make sure this happens. You got to lead with patient benefits first, not revenue. You need to frame it as, how do we help patients actually do their home program? Not, how do we make more money? Nobody wants to hear that. You have to address the workload concerns up front. You need to be specific about what will and won't change in their daily workflow, right? You have to go through those concerns. You need to provide comprehensive training. And ideally, the vendor you're working with, like us, we provide a 4 to 6 week, very comprehensive training program. And you need to give them time to practice, right? You got to give them scripts and templates on what to say to the patient, how to document it in their plan of care. You got to make it easy. We even made our plan of care templates change to have the compliant language in there every time. And you got to start with volunteers, right? Let the early adopters prove that it works, right? Then allow others to follow. You got to make sure that you're available for questions, especially in the first month. And you got to be present and supportive, right? You got to celebrate early wins. When a patient gives positive feedback, share it with the team, right? When a patient's compliance improves, and you can see that, acknowledge that and share that with the team. You got to address concerns as they arise, right? You don't want to dismiss or minimize your providers. You got to listen, and then you got to solve, right? You got to show the impact after a few months. Show them the data, right? Show them the patient compliant rates. Hopefully your software shows that, right? Ours does. Outcomes data, has it improved? Patient satisfaction scores, has it improved? You got to tie it to their values, right? Remind them why they became a therapist, to help people get better. RTM helps them do that more effectively, right? And then you might want to consider some incentives. If the program is generating some significant revenue, why wouldn't you share that with your team, right? Whether it's through bonuses or raises, we did that immediately. The bottom line is staff buy-in, it isn't automatic. You have to earn it. But when you do it right, the staff become advocates for the program, not resistors, right? If you're worried about staff buy-in, I get it, right? I've been there myself. I help a ton of practices do this every day. I put together a complete implementation guide that includes everything you need to know to do this successfully. How you want to have a staff meeting, the presentation in the beginning, what scripts you want to introduce for your team for RTM specifically, a frequently asked questions document for staff concerns, a training checklist, a weekly check-in template, how to measure and celebrate wins, right? All these things are included. I made it for you based on my own experience, helping other practices, and you can download it for free. It's called the RTM Staff Buy-in and Implementation Guide. And if you want it, just click the button right below this video. I want to help you. If you do want to implement this and you're having a hard time, maybe you have a particularly resistant team or you're worried about specific concerns, book a free call with me. It's 15 minutes. I've been through this. I can help. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it, and I'll see you next time.